I don't think it's particularly controversial at this point to make the following observation, which is that the core of the George Bush, Dick Cheney template for the war on terror was something that Barack Obama continuously, repeatedly, and vehemently condemned when he was a senator and then when he was a candidate. And yet that very same architecture, the crux of that architecture, is something that Barack Obama has enthusiastically and on virtually every level come to embrace. I don't mean that he's failed to reverse it or that he just hasn't been fast enough about undoing it. I mean that he's embraced it enthusiastically. It used to be that when I would say that back in 2009, it was like some kind of bizarre heresy. And people just found it inconceivable that I would even think about comparing George Bush and Barack Obama. And of course, Robert Gibbs famously said that anybody who would ever compare George Bush to Barack Obama in any way is somebody who needs psychiatric help. That was in his rant against the professional left. And yet now, 2 short years later, I think it's pretty much of a consensus that Obama has replicated all of those policies. When I used to say that, I used to spend most of my time proving it by going through case after case after case. I no longer feel a need to do that because I think it's fairly well established that that's the case. And one of the points that I think is so critical to make about this is that for a while it seemed like the problem with that Barack Obama had embraced every single one of the George Bush policies with a couple of exceptions, but essentially the fundamental architecture of it. The problem with it was not only that he swore over and over and over when running for president that he would undo it and then did exactly the opposite. That is a problem, but that's not the problem that I think is the critical problem. And the problem is not that these heinous policies that 50% of the country, which calls themselves Democrats and progressives, pretended for all those years to find so horrible and objectionable, now suddenly seem fairly complacent and content with it all. That too is a problem, but that's not the huge problem that I'm about to talk about. And it's also not the problem that these policies that are in fact oppressive and dangerous as civil liberties abridgments for all the reasons that I've just talked about are continuing, though that too is true. The huge problem is that it used to be the case prior to January 20th, 2009, that there was a very spirited debate about these issues. There was at least the pretext, the pretense of divisiveness, because all of these policies, like indefinite detention, putting people into cages and denying them the right to have habeas corpus, claiming that even allegedly illegal acts on the part of the executive are state secrets, so vital that no courts can examine what they are. All of these ideas, and especially the idea that the war on terror is an actual war in which the battlefield is not any finite physical space, but is the entire planet, so that the president can exert war powers anywhere at any time without any limitations. All of those premises that were the defining premises of George Bush's and Dick Cheney's radicalism used to be the subject of extensive divisiveness and debate because they were considered to be radical right-wing Republican policies. And Democrats constantly claim that they objected to all of these things. Military commissions, creating new-founded tribunals to convict people instead of using our regular justice system. All of these things, you had Republicans on one side arguing in favor of it. You had Democrats on the other side going on television and talking about how it was wrong. You had John McCain in the presidential campaign defending it. You had Barack Obama standing up and saying that they were unnecessary and counterproductive and wrong and vowing to undo it. So you had a debate, or the appearance of a debate, over these issues. And what Barack Obama's embrace of these policies has done, that I think is the most significant and most disturbing effect of his doing this, is that he has taken all of these policies that not long ago were the province of right-wing radicalism, and he's converted them into bipartisan consensus. And the reason why that's so disturbing is because policies that become bipartisan consensus are removed, usually forever, from the realm of mainstream debate. Because in our country, political debates have limits, and the limits are usually defined by what Republicans and Democrats talk about. And if Republicans and Democrats disagree on a certain issue, those issues will make it into political discourse. But once the leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties agree on a certain proposition, those get removed from things that the media will cover and that people debate. And that happened in the run-up to the Iraq War, for example. If you ask journalists to this day why the media didn't more aggressively scrutinize claims about weapons of mass destruction, what they'll tell you, almost all of them, is that the Bush administration would make these claims and most Democratic leaders wouldn't contest them. There was no Democrat calling these reporters and saying, hey, what he's saying isn't true. And so this reveals this mindset that these reporters have, that once Democrats and Republicans agree on a certain issue, it's removed from the realm of consideration or debate, even for journalists. It's taken off the table. It no longer is part of our political discourse. It becomes an embedded and entrenched attribute of American political policy. And there's actually lots of historical examples where that's true. If you look at what happened in World War II and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal legislation, this whole New Deal administrative state that was created during the Roosevelt administration and then continued during the Truman administration used to be the target of the most vicious attacks by Republicans that opposed it as socialism and incursions, improper incursions by the state. And then what happened is when Dwight Eisenhower was elected president, the first Republican president after Roosevelt and Truman, instead of undoing it and dismantling it, he actually just tinkered with it and maintained it, and in some cases actually expanded it. And then it became not the policy any longer of Democrats, but the policy of Democrats and Republicans, and that was no longer debated. It just endured forever. And the same thing happened with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reforms, that during the 1960s, Goldwater conservatives in the Republican Party railed against continuously, until Richard Nixon became president and basically continued the Great Society institutions, or certainly didn't dismantle them, and then the debate went away and those persisted. And this is exactly now what's happening with George Bush and Dick Cheney's assault on civil liberties. Because Barack Obama has embraced them, the problem is not merely that they're continuing, it's that they have become even stronger as a result of now assuming the mantle of bipartisan consensus, of harmony, of being removed from the realm of debate. So what you see is former Bush officials like Jack Goldsmith, who is this extreme right-wing ideologue who used to work in the Bush Justice Department. He was the person who endorsed the legality of the criminal NSA program, who has written an article in the New Republic about 9 months ago saying that Barack Obama did more than George Bush and Dick Cheney could ever have done to entrench these terrorism policies and these civil liberties policies in the American body politic by having Congress endorse them, but mostly by making them bipartisan. And you see something else even more remarkable, which is Republicans almost instinctively love to accuse Democrats of being soft on terror or being untrustworthy on national security. And this was the attack that people like Bill Kristol and Liz Cheney and others, and Dick Cheney, launched on Barack Obama for the first few months of his presidency. He's going to trigger a terrorist attack because he's no longer torturing people. That was the attack. But it has become so glaringly obvious, so obvious and indisputable, that rather than jettisoning those policies, Obama has actually continued them, and in some cases, even expanded them beyond where Bush went, by, for example, asserting the power to target American citizens for assassination without a shred of due process, literally being the judge, jury, and executioner. That even people like Dick Cheney and Bill Kristol can no longer, with a straight face, claim that Barack Obama is being soft on terrorism and national security by abandoning Bush-Cheney policies, because he's not abandoning those policies. And even our standards of permissive truth abandonment in our political discourse doesn't allow that level of falsehood, that Barack Obama has abandoned these policies. And so what they've done is they've switched tactics, and they now not only acknowledge that he's continuing them, but they praise him for it. And they claim, I think quite rightly, a measure of vindication, that it proves that Democrats all along didn't really believe the criticisms they were voicing that George Bush was shredding the Constitution. They were saying these things opportunistically for partisan gain, and that now Obama, now that he's not a senator anymore, now that he's not a candidate anymore, now that he's president and responsible for protecting the nation, now that he has access to national security, actually sees that all along George Bush and Dick Cheney were right. Because that's a pretty fair conclusion to reach from the fact that he went from criticizing those policies to embracing them as his own. And I once wrote, and I think it's true, that Barack Obama actually won the debate on the war on terror. The problem is that he actually won the debate for the Republicans by adopting these policies as the Democratic Party's policies and therefore enshrining them forever. So that's where I think the state of civil liberties is in the age of Obama and the war on terror. It's not a particularly optimistic or sunny picture, for which I apologize, but it's not actually my fault. But that, I think, actually is where things stand. And I think there are lots of reasons why we ought to care about that. And I talked about those at the beginning, and it's the reason why I continue to focus on them, even though lots of people seem somewhat indifferent, especially now that both parties are doing it. So with that,